In April 1945, the world held its breath between war's final moments and peace's uncertain beginning. Across a shattered continent, millions of soldiers stood among the ruins of the Third Reich, surrounded by weapons beyond counting. What happened next would reshape civilization in ways no one could imagine. The greatest technology transfer in human history was about to unfold, not through treaties or negotiations, but through the oldest pattern in nature's playbook, the strong taking what they needed, the clever claiming what others overlooked, and the desperate seizing whatever remained. This is the story of how the machinery of destruction became the seeds of our modern world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, Sergeant. Harold MacDonald had been walking for 3 hours through the Harz Mountains when he noticed something odd about the cliff face. The morning sun, angling through the pine trees, caught the edge of what appeared to be a door, not a natural cave entrance, but something built by human hands. He approached carefully, his Thompson submachine gun raised, expecting perhaps a weapons cache or a final holdout of SS diehards. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The door opened onto darkness that swallowed his flashlight beam. MacDonald stepped inside, and the scale of what lay before him slowly revealed itself. The tunnel stretched ahead, not for yards but for miles, carved through solid rock. Electric lights still hummed overhead. The air carried the smell of machine oil and something else, the sweat of thousands of workers who had labored here in absolute secrecy. He walked deeper into the mountain, and the tunnel opened into a cavern so vast that his flashlight couldn't reach the far wall. Assembly lines stretched into the distance, hundreds of them, each station frozen in the middle of work that would never be completed. And on those lines, gleaming in the electric light, stood row after row of rockets, V-2 missiles, each one 46 feet tall, each one capable of reaching London in 5 minutes, each one representing technology that shouldn't exist in 1945. MacDonald had stumbled upon Mittelbau Dora, an underground factory complex that extended 7 miles through the mountain. 10,000 workers had assembled rockets here, working in perpetual twilight, breathing air thick with rock dust and chemical fumes. The scale defied comprehension. This wasn't a weapons factory. This was an underground city devoted to a single purpose, the production of vengeance. But the rockets. MacDonald discovered that morning represented only a fraction of what Nazi Germany had left scattered across Europe. Consider the mathematics of industrial warfare at its peak. 7 million tons of weapons and military equipment lay abandoned across the continent. 7 million tons. Imagine a mountain of steel and explosives rising higher than the Alps. That was the harvest of 6 years of total war. Tanks rusting in fields, submarines tied to docks, artillery pieces lined up like tombstones, and enough small arms to equip every soldier who had fought on every side of every war in human history. Nature abhors a vacuum. When the Wehrmacht collapsed, it left behind not just weapons, but knowledge, blueprints, formulas, prototypes of technologies that shouldn't have existed for decades. And into that vacuum flowed a tide of acquisition that followed patterns as ancient as conquest itself. The Soviet trophy brigades moved first. They had to. Their industrial heartland lay devastated, factories burned or dismantled during the German retreat. Soviet engineers fanned out across occupied Germany with shopping lists that read like fever dreams. Jet engines, submarine factories, synthetic fuel plants, radar systems, and those rockets, especially those rockets. They understood something fundamental. Whoever controlled this technology would shape the post-war world. By May 1945, Soviet forces had located the underground tank factory at Nordhausen. The facility contained complete production lines for the Panther tank, one of the war's most sophisticated armored vehicles. Soviet engineers didn't just study the factory, they took it. Every machine tool, every die press, every welding robot. They numbered the components, packed them in crates, and loaded them onto trains heading east. Within 6 weeks, entire factories vanished from Germany, reappearing in the Urals like industrial magic tricks. The scale of this operation challenges imagination. 160 trains per day left Soviet-occupied Germany through the summer of 1945. Each train carried 40 cars, loaded with machinery, blueprints, and sometimes the German engineers who had operated them, willing or not. The Soviet Union was literally moving Germany's industrial capacity to Russia, track by track, factory by factory, creating the foundation of its Cold War military might. But the Americans had discovered something even more valuable than hardware. They had found the mines that created it. In the Bavarian Alps, American intelligence officers were conducting what would become Operation Paperclip. Initially, a modest effort to interview German scientists, it transformed into history's greatest talent raid. 1,600 German scientists and engineers would eventually make new lives in America, bringing knowledge that existed nowhere else on Earth. The operation's architects understood a fundamental truth. You could reverse engineer machines, but you couldn't reverse engineer genius. Wernher von Braun represented the prize catch. At 33 years old, he had led the team that created the V-2 rocket, a weapon that killed 3,000 people but represented a technological leap of staggering proportions. The V-2 was the world's first ballistic missile, the first human-made object to reach space, and the ancestor of every rocket that would follow. Von Braun and his team of 127 rocket scientists surrendered to American forces in May 1945, carrying with them the knowledge to build machines that could reach the stars. An American colonel named Holger Toftoy made a decision that would echo through the decades. He hid von Braun's team from his own command, stashing them in a remote alpine resort while he worked through the political complications. The scientists were, after all, members of the SS. They had built their rockets using slave labor. They had aimed their weapons at civilian populations. But Toftoy understood that moral clarity loses to strategic necessity in the calculus of nations. He wanted those scientists in America before the Soviets found them. Meanwhile, in the ports of northern Germany, a different kind of technology transfer was unfolding. The Type 21 U-boat represented the most advanced submarine ever built. It could travel submerged for days using a revolutionary snorkel system, moving faster underwater than on the surface thanks to a streamlined hull that looked like nothing the world had seen. Traditional submarines were really surface ships that could dive when threatened. The Type 21 was a true submarine, a predator designed for the depths. When the war ended, the Allies found dozens of these vessels in various states of completion. British commandos raced through collapsed tunnels and burning dockyards to secure them before demolition charges destroyed everything. Soviet naval officers examined every bolt and weld plate, photographing details that would resurface in their own submarine designs. The French, often overlooked in the post-war scramble, grabbed complete manufacturing plans and technical documentation. But 3 Type 21 submarines simply vanished. U-2511, U-3503, and U-2506 left their bases in the final days of the war and never reached Allied ports. Their crews sailed into history's shadows, taking with them vessels that represented technology a generation ahead of anything else afloat. To this day, no one knows where they went. The Baltic Sea keeps its secrets well. The British had different priorities. They wanted the jet engines. The Junkers Jumo 004 had powered the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. At 540 miles per hour, it was 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. British engineers understood that whoever mastered jet propulsion would dominate the skies for the next half-century. At a collapsing aircraft factory near Munich, British commandos found something unexpected: complete blueprints for jet engines more advanced than the ones that had flown. The Germans had been working on axial flow engines with power outputs that seemed impossible. One British engineer, examining the design documents by flashlight as the factory burned around him, realized he was looking at the future of aviation. He rolled up the blueprints and carried them out as the roof collapsed behind him. Those documents would birth the engines that power commercial jets to this day. The French, occupying their zone of Germany, took a different approach. They grabbed what the great powers overlooked. The entire Mauser rifle works dismantled and shipped to France. Optical equipment from Zeiss that would transform their defense industry, and something that seemed minor at the time but would define ground warfare for generations: plans for wire-guided anti-tank missiles. The idea of steering a missile by unspooling a wire behind it appeared almost comical to some observers. But the French engineers saw its potential. They took those plans and built the SS-10, which would become the most effective tank killer of the Cold War. This wasn't simple looting. What unfolded across Germany in 1945 followed patterns as old as nature itself. Think of a forest ecosystem processing a fallen giant. When a massive tree crashes to the forest floor, it doesn't disappear overnight. Fungi begin breaking down the wood. Insects tunnel through the bark. Bacteria digest the cellulose. Small plants root in the decaying mass. Each organism takes what it can use, discarding what it cannot. The tree's stored energy flows back into the ecosystem, feeding new growth. Germany in 1945 was that fallen giant. Each nation's industrial digestive system broke down the technology differently, absorbing what matched their needs, leaving the rest. The Soviets took heavy industry, tank factories, submarine plants, anything that produced steel and fire. The Americans cherry-picked the scientists and the cutting-edge research, technology so advanced it seemed like science fiction. The British focused on aviation and naval technology. The French grabbed manufacturing capability and forgotten innovations. But understanding this transformation requires grasping the scale of what existed. German military production in 1944 had achieved levels that still seem impossible. Despite Allied bombing, despite resource shortages, despite the chaos of retreat, German factories produced 40,000 aircraft, 19,000 tanks, and 6,000 V-1 flying bombs. They manufactured 1 million tons of ammunition per month. They built submarines faster than the Allies could sink them. Right up until the final weeks of the war, the infrastructure supporting this production sprawled across Europe. Not just factories, but research institutes, testing grounds, underground complexes, and facilities so secret that even today, their full extent remains unknown. When Allied soldiers began mapping this industrial landscape, they found themselves in a maze of wonders and horrors intertwined so completely they couldn't be separated. In Bavaria, American troops discovered wind tunnels capable of testing aircraft at speeds approaching Mach 1. The tunnels used techniques that wouldn't be reinvented in America for another decade. At Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, Soviet engineers found test stands that had launched experimental rockets to altitudes of 100 miles, the edge of space, in 1944. In Austria, British forces uncovered laboratories working on magnetic tape recording, with fidelity that wouldn't be commercially available. Until the 1960s, individual soldiers made choices in those months that would ripple through time. An American private deciding whether to destroy a cache of German documents or preserve them. A Soviet lieutenant choosing which factory components to prioritize for shipment. A British corporal recognizing that the submarine batteries he was examining could revolutionize civilian electronics. Each choice, made in the chaos of occupation, became a fork in history's path. The transformation began not with grand strategy, but with these individual moments of decision. Some chose preservation over destruction. Some chose knowledge over vengeance. And some, like Colonel Toftoy hiding his rocket scientists, chose strategic advantage over immediate justice. But the greatest transformation was happening in the minds of those who examined what Germany had created. They were realizing that the technology gap wasn't years, it was decades. In some fields, German research had leaped so far ahead that understanding it fully would take the rest of the century. Jet engines, ballistic missiles, guided weapons, magnetic tape, infrared sights, swept-wing aircraft. Each represented not just an incremental advance, but a fundamental breakthrough. Consider the V-2 rocket that Sergeant MacDonald found in that mountain factory. It flew at 3,500 miles per hour. It reached altitudes of 100 miles. It navigated using a gyroscopic guidance system of stunning precision. It burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and alcohol in a combustion chamber that endured temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Every one of these features required solving problems that the rest of the world hadn't even identified yet. When American engineers first examined a captured V-2, they thought it was a hoax. The technology seemed too advanced. The tolerances were too tight. The design was too elegant. It couldn't possibly work. Then they saw the photographs of London neighborhoods reduced to rubble, each crater marking where a V-2 had arrived faster than sound, giving no warning, hitting with the force of a small earthquake. It worked all right. They just couldn't yet understand how. This was the deeper treasure scattered across Germany in 1945. Not just weapons, but doors to futures that hadn't existed before. The Allied powers, stumbling through those doors, discovered possibilities that would reshape everything from warfare to space exploration, from commercial aviation to consumer electronics. The seeds had been planted in a harvest of destruction. What would grow from them, how those seeds would germinate and spread across the world, would define the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The transformation was beginning, following laws as immutable as thermodynamics. Energy flows from high concentration to low, complexity emerges from chaos, and innovation adapts to every environment where it takes root. As summer 1945 progressed and trains loaded with German technology rolled in every direction from the compass, a new pattern was taking shape. The weapons were becoming something else. The science of destruction was about to pupate into technologies of creation. And the world that emerged from this metamorphosis would be stranger, more connected, and more powerful than anyone standing in those underground factories could possibly imagine. The mathematics of what followed should not surprise us. Nature teaches this lesson in every ecosystem. Resources flow from abundance to scarcity, following gradients as predictable as water running downhill. In the summer of 1945, Germany represented the highest concentration of military technology on Earth, and surrounding it were nations depleted by war, hungry for the tools to rebuild their strength. What happened next was inevitable. 160 trains departed Soviet-occupied Germany every single day through June, July, and August. 160 trains. Each dawn brought fresh locomotives to factory gates, and each dusk saw them disappear eastward, loaded with the bones of the Wehrmacht's war machine. If you had stood beside those tracks and watched this procession, you would have witnessed the largest technology transfer in human history, unfolding at the speed of steam and steel. The Soviet operation possessed an elegant simplicity. They created trophy brigades, specialized military units whose sole mission was acquisition and transportation. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were engineers, machinists, electricians, men who could look at a factory and understand not just what it made, but how to dismantle it, transport it, and reassemble it 3,000 miles away. The brigades worked with remarkable efficiency. They would arrive at a facility, say a ball-bearing plant or a tank factory, and spend 3 days mapping it. Every machine tool received a number. Every power connection was documented. They photographed the layout from multiple angles, creating three-dimensional maps on paper. Then came the dismantling. Cutting torches hissed through the night as massive machines were separated from their foundations. Cranes lifted equipment that weighed dozens of tons. Specialized crews packed bearings in grease, wrapped precision instruments in wool, crated electronics in sawdust. Within 2 weeks, a functioning factory would vanish completely. The buildings might remain, but they became empty shells. The industrial heart had been extracted and was rolling eastward on rails, headed for Sverdlovsk or Chelyabinsk or any of a dozen Soviet industrial cities that would receive an unexpected transfusion of German engineering expertise. Consider what traveled on those trains. From the Zeiss optical works came equipment for producing precision lenses, technology the Soviet Union had never possessed. From submarine factories on the Baltic came specialized steel-forming machinery that could shape pressure hulls to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. From aircraft plants came wind tunnels, hydraulic presses for forming wing sections, and most valuable of all, the jigs and dies that held the secret shapes of swept-wing designs. But machinery alone doesn't build an industry. You need the knowledge to use it. The Soviet trophy brigades understood this. They took the German engineers too. In occupied Germany, Soviet officers presented German technical specialists with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Come east and continue your work under Soviet supervision, or stay and face uncertain prospects in the ruins. Thousands accepted. Some went willingly, seeing opportunity in the chaos. Others went at gunpoint. But they went, traveling in those same trains, riding in passenger cars, attached to freight cars loaded with their former workplaces. By autumn 1945, entire German research institutes had been recreated on Soviet soil. The personnel spoke German, used German equipment, and worked on problems assigned by Soviet military planners. It was an extraordinary solution to a simple problem. The Soviet Union needed advanced technology immediately, and conquering Germany had given them the means to obtain it. The transformation of this captured knowledge would take years to fully manifest, but the first fruits appeared quickly. Soviet tank designers studied the Panther's sloped armor and sophisticated suspension system. They couldn't simply copy it. Soviet industrial capacity couldn't match German precision manufacturing. Instead, they adapted the principles. The result was the T-54, a tank that combined German engineering concepts with Soviet industrial pragmatism. It could be manufactured in enormous quantities using rougher tolerances, yet it incorporated the key innovations that made the Panther so formidable. The T-54 would become the most produced tank in history. Rumbling through conflicts from Hungary to the Middle East, from Africa to Southeast Asia, a direct descendant of technology captured in that frantic summer. Meanwhile, the Americans were conducting their own technology harvest, but with a fundamentally different approach. Operation Paperclip had begun as a modest intelligence mission. Interview German scientists, assess their knowledge, file reports. But as American intelligence officers began to grasp what existed in Germany, the mission transformed into something far more ambitious. The Americans wanted the minds, not just the machines. They understood that you could reverse engineer hardware, but you couldn't reverse engineer the creative process that had produced it. Genius doesn't travel on trains. It walks through passport control, carries suitcases, and brings its family. Werner von Braun became Paperclip's symbolic center, but around him orbited 1,600 other German scientists and engineers, each bringing expertise that simply didn't exist in America. Arthur Rudolph had solved the manufacturing challenges of building rockets at scale. Kurt Debus knew how to launch them safely. Kraft Erika had designed guidance systems. Walter Dornberger had managed the entire operation. Together, they represented the most concentrated collection of rocket expertise on Earth. The legal complications were substantial. Many of these men had been Nazi Party members. Some had held SS rank. They had used slave labor. They had aimed their weapons at civilians. American military intelligence officers solved this problem through creative paperwork. They literally took paper clips and attached them to folders containing altered biographies. The past was clipped away, replaced with sanitized versions that emphasized technical knowledge while minimizing political affiliations. Hence the operation's informal name, which became official. In October 1945, the first group of German rocket scientists arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas. Imagine their journey. from the technological pinnacle of the Third Reich to a dusty American army base near the Mexican border. They lived in barracks, worked in borrowed facilities, and spent their evenings trying to explain to American engineers concepts that had no English equivalents because the technology didn't exist in English-speaking countries. The cultural collision produced remarkable moments. German engineers, accustomed to unlimited budgets and absolute priority, had to adapt to American bureaucracy and peacetime procurement. They discovered that in America, they needed purchase orders for equipment, couldn't simply commandeer facilities, and had to justify every expense. After years of "it is needed for the Führer's weapons program" opening every door, they now filled out forms in triplicate, but the knowledge transfer proceeded. At White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, von Braun's team began launching captured V-2 rockets, each test adding to American understanding. They weren't just firing the missiles. They were teaching American engineers how to handle liquid propellants, how to ignite rocket engines, how to prevent combustion instabilities that could tear a rocket apart. Each launch was a seminar in technologies America was learning for the first time. The British, meanwhile, were conducting their own acquisition program with typical pragmatism. They called it Operation Surgeon, and it focused on jet propulsion technology with surgical precision. British engineers understood that jets would revolutionize aviation, and German jets flew 100 miles per hour faster than anything Britain possessed. The crown jewel was the axial flow jet engine. Traditional jet engines used centrifugal compressors. The air entered at the front and was flung outward by spinning discs. Axial flow engines compressed air by pushing it through multiple stages of rotating and stationary blades, straight through the engine like water through a turbine. The design was more efficient, more powerful, and crucially more scalable. You could make axial flow engines as large as needed, while centrifugal designs hit fundamental limitations. At a BMW factory near Munich, British engineers found complete documentation for the BMW 003 engine, the most advanced axial flow design the Germans had completed. They took everything: blueprints, test data, manufacturing specifications, and the engineers who had created it. This knowledge would flow directly into British jet development, birthing engines that would power commercial aviation for decades. But the British also discovered something unexpected in German submarine technology. U-boat batteries used a revolutionary design that could deliver enormous power in short bursts, perfect for the underwater sprint speeds that made Type 21 submarines so dangerous. British engineers examining these batteries realized they had applications far beyond submarines. The chemistry and engineering principles could revolutionize energy storage for civilian applications. They took the batteries, took the engineers who designed them, and began adapting them for peacetime use. The French, operating in their occupation zone, took an approach that reflected their circumstances. They had been invaded, occupied, and fought over. Their industrial capacity was damaged, their economy exhausted. They couldn't compete with Soviet or American resources, so they grabbed what the great powers had overlooked. The entire Mauser rifle works vanished into France. Dies, lathes, milling machines, assembly lines, everything needed to produce rifles at scale. The French understood that infantry weapons would be needed for colonial conflicts that everyone could see coming. They took optical equipment from Zeiss that would transform French defense optics. They grabbed acoustic torpedo technology that would modernize French naval warfare, and they found the wire-guided missile documentation. The Germans had developed this concept for anti-tank warfare: launch a missile, guide it to the target by sending electrical signals down a thin wire that unspooled behind the weapon. It seemed almost absurd when you first encountered it, a missile on a leash. But the principle was sound, and the French saw its potential. They took those plans and built the SS-10, which would become the most effective tank destroyer of the Cold War era, capable of hitting targets at ranges where tank guns were useless, What united all these efforts was the sheer scale of what existed to be taken. Germany hadn't just built weapons. It had constructed an entire parallel technological civilization, advanced in specific areas beyond anything that existed elsewhere. The Allies were discovering this civilization piece by piece, factory by factory, and each discovery revealed new depths. In underground facilities beneath the Harz Mountains, American troops found laboratories working on infrared detection systems that could see in total darkness. In Austria, British forces uncovered acoustic research that had achieved sound cancellation, technology that wouldn't be commercially viable for another 40 years. In Czechoslovakia, Soviet engineers discovered precision machining equipment capable of tolerances that seemed impossible. The dispersal followed patterns that should be familiar to anyone who has studied natural systems. High concentrations flow toward low concentrations until equilibrium is reached. Germany represented the high concentration, 7 million tons of weapons, thousands of patents, hundreds of research institutes, tens of thousands of scientists and engineers. The surrounding nations represented low concentrations, depleted by war. The technology flowed outward along gradients of need and opportunity, seeking equilibrium. But human systems are more complex than simple diffusion. Political barriers, national interests, and individual choices shaped the flow in ways that pure physics couldn't predict. The Iron Curtain was descending across Europe, and technology captured on one side would not freely flow to the other. Germany was being divided, and with it, the treasure trove of technology was being split along ideological lines. The city of Nordhausen became a symbol of this division. The underground V2 factory that Sergeant MacDonald had discovered lay in what would become the Soviet zone. But before Soviet forces arrived to claim it, American troops had 2 weeks of access. They grabbed what they could, 100 complete V2 rockets, boxcars loaded with components, and most importantly, von Braun's technical archive. 14 tons of documents that contained everything needed to build and fly the missiles. American soldiers loaded this treasure onto 300 rail cars and moved it west before the Soviets arrived. When Soviet trophy brigades reached Nordhausen, they found the facilities mostly intact but stripped of the most valuable materials. They took what remained, the production equipment, the test stands, the German engineers who hadn't fled west. Each side believed it had captured the essential elements. Both were right. The Americans had the knowledge and the key personnel. The Soviets had the manufacturing infrastructure and enough German expertise to understand it. This pattern repeated across Germany. The best scientists fled west toward American lines. The best factories were in the Soviet zone. Advanced prototypes were scattered across both zones, some captured by one side, some by the other. The technology was being divided before it could fully disperse, creating 2 parallel streams of development that would characterize the Cold War. In the Baltic ports, the submarine situation exemplified this division. The British took U-2511, a nearly complete Type 21, and sailed it to Britain for detailed study. The Soviets captured several Type 21s in various states of completion and began extensive analysis. The Americans received technical documentation, but no complete submarines. Each nation would develop its own submarine designs based on different pieces of the German technology puzzle. But 3 Type 21 submarines had slipped through all these grasping hands. U-2511, U-3503, and U-2506 left their bases in the final days of the war and never reported to any Allied port. Their crews had sailed into uncertainty, perhaps hoping to escape prosecution, perhaps simply continuing to follow their final orders in the absence of new ones. The Baltic Sea received them and has kept their secrets for 8 decades. These vanishings add a haunting note to the technology transfer. Not everything was captured. Not everything was documented. Some knowledge simply disappeared, carried by men who vanished into history's shadows. Those submarines represented not just military hardware, but expertise, crews who knew how to operate the most advanced submarines afloat. Where did that expertise go? Did it die with them in the depths? Or did some of those sailors find new homes, carrying their knowledge to unexpected places? By winter 1945, the Great Dispersal was well underway. Soviet trains still rolled east, though the pace had slowed to perhaps 80 per day. American ships carried German scientists across the Atlantic. British aircraft ferried jet engine components to factories outside London. French trucks moved Mauser equipment through the Vosges Mountains. The technology was spreading, finding new soil, beginning to take root in environments very different from where it had grown. The transformation was entering its next phase. The captured weapons and machines would now be studied, adapted, and reimagined. The migration of technology would give birth to metamorphosis. As each nation's engineers and scientists began the work of understanding what they had taken and transforming it into something new, something that would shape the world for the rest of the century and beyond. Inside the secret hangars at Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers approached the Messerschmitt Me 262 with the reverence anatomists might show when studying an alien life form. The aircraft sat under bright lights, every panel removed, every system exposed. It was beautiful in the way that purely functional things can be beautiful. No wasted lines, no unnecessary weight, every curve serving a purpose that the engineers were only beginning to understand. The swept wings were the mystery that would not yield easily. Traditional aircraft wings extended straight out from the fuselage, perpendicular to the direction of flight. But the Me-262's wings swept backward at 18 degrees, giving the aircraft a predatory look, like a bird of prey with its wings pulled back for a dive. The American engineers measured, photographed, and tested. Why this angle? What advantage did it provide? The answer emerged slowly through wind tunnel testing and theoretical work that merged German research with American experimentation. At high speeds, approaching the speed of sound, conventional wings generated shock waves that created tremendous drag and instability. Swept wings delayed these effects, allowing aircraft to fly faster before encountering the sound barrier's turbulence. The Germans had discovered this principle through rigorous research at speeds American wind tunnels couldn't yet reach. This knowledge would birth the F-86 Sabre, the first American swept-wing fighter. When it met Soviet MiG-15s over Korea, aircraft that also incorporated German swept-wing research, the skies filled with jets whose lineage traced directly back to that captured Messerschmitt. The battles over the Yalu River were, in a sense, continuations of German aerodynamic research, fought by pilots who had never heard of the scientists whose work made their aircraft possible. But the transformation happening in these secret facilities went far deeper than copying designs. The engineers were learning to think differently about problems. German approaches to engineering emphasized elegance and efficiency in ways that American mass production methods did not. American industry excelled at building large quantities of good enough equipment. German industry had focused on building smaller quantities of exceptional equipment. Each approach had its merits, and the fusion of these philosophies would create something neither could achieve alone. Across the Atlantic, in the Soviet Union, a different kind of metamorphosis was occurring. Soviet tank designers had always favored simplicity and reliability over sophistication. Their T-34 tank had won acclaim not for its elegance but for its robustness. It could be manufactured by semi-skilled workers, maintained by crews with minimal training, and operated in conditions that would immobilize more refined machines. But the German Panther tank represented a different philosophy. Its sloped armor maximized protection without excessive weight. Its torsion bar suspension provided superior handling. Its long-barreled gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges they couldn't reach. Soviet designers studied these features with intense interest, looking for principles they could adapt to their own design philosophy. The result was the T-54, a tank that represented the most successful fusion of German and Soviet approaches to armored warfare. From Germany came the sloped armor concept, refined and simplified. The suspension borrowed German principles, but used Soviet manufacturing methods that traded precision for producibility. The gun design incorporated German ballistic insights, but simplified the construction. The result was a tank that could be produced in the tens of thousands, yet incorporated innovations that had made German armor so formidable. The T-54 would become the most widely produced tank in history. It would rumble through the streets of Budapest in 1956, crushing the Hungarian uprising. It would face Israeli tanks in the deserts of the Middle East. It would fight in Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan. Variants would serve into the 21st century. The genetic code of the German Panther lived on through this evolutionary descendant, adapted to thrive in a different industrial ecosystem. But some transformations occurred at levels invisible to casual observation. German synthetic rubber formulas, developed because Germany lacked natural rubber sources, revolutionized American tire production. The Germans had been forced to innovate, creating synthetic materials that in some applications outperformed natural rubber. American chemical companies studying these formulas realized they had applications far beyond tires, in seals, in hoses, in industrial components of every kind. Magnetic tape provided another example of transformation at the molecular level. German engineers had perfected high-fidelity audio recording using magnetic tape during the war, primarily for radio broadcasts. Allied intelligence officers monitoring German radio had noticed something odd. The broadcasts sounded live, but were clearly recorded, with quality far exceeding any recording technology the Allies possessed. When American troops captured German radio stations, they found the answer: magnetophone recorders using ferric oxide tape. The quality was astonishing. Frequency response and dynamic range that seemed impossible for recorded media. American engineers brought samples back, and within a decade, magnetic tape had transformed American broadcasting, then data storage, then music recording, then video. The unbroken chain of development leads from those captured German recorders to the digital storage systems that now preserve human knowledge. Night vision technology followed an even stranger path. German troops had used infrared scopes mounted on rifles, allowing them to see in complete darkness, a capability that seemed almost magical to soldiers who encountered it. The scopes used special phosphors that converted infrared light into visible green images. American military researchers studied these scopes intensely, recognizing their battlefield value. But an army doctor named John Arnold saw something else. He realized that the same technology could allow doctors to observe blood flow through infant skin, detecting circulation problems in premature babies. The military night vision technology, designed to spot enemy soldiers in darkness, evolved into medical devices that saved countless newborn lives. The transformation from weapon to healing tool occurred through one person recognizing that a technology designed for one purpose could serve another entirely. In Huntsville, Alabama, Werner von Braun and his team were conducting their own metamorphosis. They had come to America as creators of weapons, but America had different dreams for rockets. The military applications were obvious. Missiles could deliver nuclear warheads across continents. But some visionaries saw further possibilities. What if rockets could carry scientific instruments above the atmosphere? What if they could place satellites in orbit? What if they could reach the moon? Von Braun's team worked in sweltering Alabama heat instead of Baltic cold. But they were still solving the same fundamental problems: how to pump tons of propellant per second, how to ignite it without destroying the engine, how to steer a vehicle traveling at miles per second. The V2 had been their starting point, but they were stretching the design, enlarging it, improving it, learning from failures and successes. The Redstone rocket emerged first, essentially an enlarged V2 with American components. Then Jupiter, larger still. Then the Saturn series, growing in stages until Saturn V stood as tall as a 30-story building, capable of generating 7,500,000 pounds of thrust. powerful enough to send 3 men to the moon. The genetic code was still visible. The basic engine design, the use of liquid oxygen and kerosene, the guidance system's fundamental architecture. But it had evolved, adapted to new purposes, transformed from weapon to vehicle of exploration. This transformation from destruction to creation occurred in field after field. Code-breaking computers, developed by both sides to crack military encryptions, spawned the digital revolution. Proximity fuses, designed to detonate anti-aircraft shells near their targets, miniaturized into the transistors that would transform electronics. Submarine sonar, meant to hunt enemy vessels, evolved into medical ultrasound that let doctors see inside living bodies without surgery. Consider the pattern here. A technology is developed for military purposes, optimized for specific wartime needs. But the underlying principles have broader applications. In peacetime, different eyes examine the technology, asking different questions. What else could this do? What problems could it solve? What new possibilities does it open? The metamorphosis chambers, those facilities where captured German technology was studied, became crucibles of innovation precisely because they forced this rethinking. Engineers couldn't simply copy German designs. They had to understand the principles, adapt them to different industrial capabilities, reimagine them for different purposes. The process was transformative. At Boeing's facilities in Seattle, engineers studied German swept-wing research while designing what would become the 707, the aircraft that would bring jet travel to the masses. The swept wings that had made the Me-262 a deadly fighter now graced an airliner carrying business travelers and families across continents. The transformation was complete. The same aerodynamic principles that had enabled weapons of war now enabled bridges of peace, connecting cultures and economies in ways impossible before. German jet engine technology followed a similar path. The engines that powered interceptors now powered commercial aircraft. The metallurgy developed to withstand combustion temperatures hot enough to melt ordinary steel now produced turbine blades that could run for thousands of hours without failure. The fuel injection systems, the cooling techniques, the anti-vibration designs, all migrated from military to civilian applications. Submarine technology underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The streamlined hull designs of Type 21 U-boats influenced not just military submarines, but civilian underwater research vessels. The snorkel system, designed to let U-boats run diesel engines while submerged, evolved into life support systems for deep-sea habitats. The battery technology, developed for underwater endurance, found its way into the first practical electric vehicles. But the transformation wasn't just technical, it was also human. The German scientists and engineers working in American, British, French, and Soviet facilities were themselves being transformed. They were learning new languages, adapting to new cultures, training the next generation who would carry these technologies forward. Werner von Braun became an American citizen in 1955. He appeared on television, explaining rocket science to American children. He worked with Walt Disney, creating animations that made space travel seem achievable. The man who had built weapons aimed at London was now inspiring a generation to dream of reaching the stars. The transformation was personal as well as technical. Kurt Tank, who had designed the Focke-Wulf 190, one of the war's most feared fighters, found himself in Argentina after the war, where he created that nation's first jet aircraft. Later, he moved to India, where his knowledge helped establish an entire aerospace industry. His design philosophy, forged in wartime Germany, took root in countries that had been neutral or opposed to Germany during the war. This dispersal of knowledge and expertise created unexpected connections. German scientists working in the Soviet Union trained Russian engineers who would build the spacecraft that put Yuri Gagarin in orbit. German scientists working in America trained American engineers who would build the spacecraft that landed on the moon. The competition between these two space programs was, in a sense, a competition between different branches of the same family tree, both rooted in German wartime research. The evolution accelerated. Each generation of technology built on the previous one, but the rate of improvement increased. The Me-262 flew in 1944 at 540 miles per hour. Just 15 years later, the X-15 research aircraft, incorporating swept wings, rocket engines, and heat-resistant materials all descended from German research, flew at 4,520 miles per hour, more than 8 times faster. This acceleration wasn't coincidental. The captured German technology had compressed decades of development into years. Instead of slowly discovering swept-wing principles through incremental research, American engineers had the answers and worked backward to understand the questions. This reverse engineering of knowledge itself became a new methodology, a way of leapfrogging development stages. But something more fundamental was occurring. The technologies weren't just being copied or adapted, they were breeding. Jet engines combined with swept wings created a new generation of aircraft. Rocket engines combined with miniaturized electronics created guided missiles. Magnetic tape combined with computing machinery created data storage. The technologies were cross-pollinating, producing offspring that bore characteristics of multiple parents. In laboratories and factories across the industrialized world, the weapons of 1945 were pupating into the tools of the future. The chrysalis was industrial research and development. The emergence would continue for decades, each new generation of technology revealing new possibilities, opening new frontiers. The V-2 rocket that killed 3,000 people in London would, through its descendant, the Saturn V, carry 12 humans to walk on another world. The jet fighter that shot down Allied bombers would, through its descendants, carry millions of passengers safely across oceans. The submarine that hunted convoys would, through its descendants, explore ocean depths no human had seen before. This was the great metamorphosis, not just transformation of metal and electronics, but transformation of purpose. The energy and ingenuity that had gone into creating weapons was being redirected toward exploration, connection, and discovery. The same species that had created such devastating tools of war was demonstrating the capacity to transform those tools into instruments of progress. The process wasn't complete. Military applications would continue. The Cold War demanded it. But the dual-use nature of technology meant that every military advance potentially served civilian purposes as well. The guidance systems for missiles became the navigation systems for airliners. The communication systems for military satellites became the foundation for global telecommunications. The computers for calculating missile trajectories became the computers for weather prediction, medical research, and eventually the device you likely carry in your pocket. In these metamorphosis chambers, through the late 1940s and into the 50s and 60s, the shape of the modern world was being formed. Not through grand design, but through countless small decisions, adaptations, and innovations, all building on foundations laid in wartime Germany. The transformation was organic, evolutionary, following patterns that repeated across technologies and nations, and it was far from over. The seeds planted in 1945 would continue sprouting for generations, each new growth revealing possibilities that the original planters never imagined. Not all of Germany's weapons found their way into official hands. While governments conducted their organized acquisitions, another kind of redistribution was happening in the shadows. Chaotic, entrepreneurial, and following rules far older than international law. This was the black market, and by 1950 it had grown into a global network worth $800 million, moving German weapons to conflicts that official channels refused to supply. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 7 million tons of weapons scattered across Europe, millions of soldiers being demobilized, many returning to devastated homes with nothing but their weapons and their knowledge of how to use them. Conflicts erupting in colonies seeking independence, in nations choosing sides in the Cold War, in regions where old hatreds reignited now that the great powers had turned their attention elsewhere. Supply, demand, and men willing to connect them. In the warehouses of Buenos Aires, wooden crates stenciled with Wehrmacht markings sat stacked to the ceiling. In Cairo's sprawling bazaars, you could buy a Mauser rifle for the price of a good meal. In Marseille's dockside taverns, men who spoke in low voices could arrange shipments of anything from pistols to anti-aircraft guns. The network operated like mycelium beneath a forest floor, invisible but essential, recycling military nutrients through the world's conflicts. At the center of one such network sat Otto Skorzeny, and if the legitimate technology transfer represented daylight acquisition, Skorzeny represented the midnight trade. He had been Hitler's favorite commando, the man who rescued Mussolini from mountain captivity in 1943, the architect of operations so audacious they seemed fictional. In the war's final days, he had vanished, slipping through Allied fingers despite being one of the most wanted men in Europe. By 1950, Skorzeny was living openly in Madrid, protected by Franco's government, and running an arms network that stretched from Spain to Egypt, from Syria to Argentina. He understood something fundamental. The end of World War II hadn't ended warfare. It had merely distributed it to smaller stages where the great powers preferred to fight through proxies rather than face each other directly. Skorzeny's network had access to astonishing quantities of material, Wehrmacht depots that official forces had missed or deemed too remote to bother with, weapons that soldiers had hidden before surrendering, intending to retrieve them later, equipment that corrupt officials in various armies were willing to lose from inventory in exchange for cash. The supply seemed inexhaustible, and demand was growing as colonial conflicts intensified across Africa and Asia. Consider the path of a Tiger tank, one of the most formidable armored vehicles ever built, weighing 56 tons, mounting an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges beyond their ability to fight back. When the war ended, the Allies destroyed most Tigers they captured. They were too mechanically complex, too fuel-hungry, too specialized for occupation duties. But some survived in remote depots, in forests where retreating German units had abandoned them. In collector hands across Europe, through Skorzeny's network, Tiger components moved from hidden storage in Bavaria through Spain to Egypt. The Egyptians were modernizing their military, preparing for conflict with Israel, and they wanted German equipment. It was well made, available, and came without the political strings attached to American or Soviet arms. The Tiger parts arrived, were assembled by German veterans Skorzeny had recruited, and soon Egyptian armored units were training on vehicles that had fought in Russia and North Africa. The Me-109 fighter followed an even more unlikely path. Hundreds had been captured in various states of completion. Some went to museums, some to scrap yards, but others went into storage in Czechoslovakia, where a communist government was happy to sell them to anyone with hard currency. Through a network of shell companies and false documentation, these fighters, which had battled the RAF over Britain, ended up in Israel, repainted with the Star of David, flown by pilots who had survived the Holocaust, fighting against Arab air forces equipped with British Spitfires. The irony was profound. Jewish pilots flying Nazi fighters, the enemies of yesterday, serving the survivors of genocide. But small arms represented the network's real volume trade. The Wehrmacht had manufactured millions of rifles, machine guns, and pistols. The MG-42 machine gun was particularly prized. It fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of comparable weapons, and it was built to tolerances that allowed it to function in conditions that would jam lesser designs. When conflicts erupted in Indochina, Algeria, Kenya, Malaya, and a dozen other places, combatants on all sides found themselves wielding German weapons. The distribution followed predictable patterns. Weapons flowed along gradients of profit and need, pooling in conflict zones, creating an underground river of steel that no government could dam. A rifle captured in Germany in 1945 might be sold to a dealer in Marseille in 1947, shipped to Algiers in 1949, transferred to FLN guerrillas in 1954, captured by French forces in 1957, and end up in the hands of a collector in 1970. Each transfer added to someone's profit and to a conflict's lethality. In French Indochina, the situation reached levels of absurdity that only war can create. French Foreign Legion units, many of them German veterans who had joined the Legion after the war, fought using MG-42 machine guns and MP-40 submachine guns. They faced Viet Minh guerrillas who had been supplied with captured Japanese weapons, some of which were themselves based on German designs. And training the Viet Minh in tactics and strategy were Wehrmacht veterans who had joined the communist cause, either out of ideology or because they had nowhere else to go. These German veterans found themselves in strange positions throughout the world. Some trained armies in South America, bringing Wehrmacht doctrine to nations that had been neutral or opposed to Germany. Some joined the French Foreign Legion, which asked few questions about pasts and offered new identities. Some went to Egypt, Syria, or other Middle Eastern nations as military advisors. Their knowledge was valuable, their loyalty was negotiable, and their skills were in demand. The network operated with remarkable efficiency, despite, or perhaps because of, its illegal nature. There were no regulations to navigate, no oversight committees to satisfy, no export licenses to obtain. A buyer contacted a seller, terms were negotiated, money changed hands, and weapons moved. The entire transaction might take days instead of the months or years that government procurement required. By 1960, German small arms outnumbered American weapons in Third World arsenals. This wasn't because German weapons were necessarily better, though many were excellent, but because they were available in enormous quantities at reasonable prices, and the sellers asked no awkward questions about end use. A rebel leader in Angola could buy enough Mauser rifles to equip a battalion without explaining his intentions, or signing treaties, or allowing inspections. The network's geography was revealing. Weapons moved from Europe, where they were concentrated, to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where conflicts created demand. But the intermediate nodes were key. Spain, where Franco's government looked the other way. Switzerland, where banking secrecy protected transactions. Egypt, which served as a hub for distribution throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Argentina, which became the primary conduit to South America. These nodes operated like metabolic organs in a body, processing and redistributing resources. Weapons arrived in bulk, were sorted, often refurbished or modified, then shipped in smaller quantities to final destinations. Each node added value through these services, and each node's operators grew wealthy, facilitating the trade. Skorzny's network was the most famous but hardly the only one. Jewish underground organizations moved weapons to Palestine before Israel's independence. Many of them salvaged German arms. The organization Gehlen, run by former Wehrmacht intelligence officers working for American intelligence, moved weapons to anti-communist forces throughout Eastern Europe. Criminal syndicates in Marseille, Naples, and Hamburg treated weapons as just another commodity, alongside drugs and stolen goods. The technology transfer happening through these shadow networks differed fundamentally from the official acquisitions. Governments wanted the cutting edge: jets, rockets, electronics. The black market dealt in bread-and-butter weapons, rifles that worked reliably, machine guns that didn't jam, mortars that could be maintained with simple tools. These were the technologies that mattered in bush wars and insurgencies, conflicts fought not by jet fighters, but by infantry with small arms. Yet this distribution had profound effects on global conflict patterns. The ready availability of German weapons lowered the threshold for organized violence. A rebel movement that might have struggled to arm itself could now, with modest resources, equip hundreds of fighters with reliable weapons. Colonial powers found their monopoly on military force eroded by arms flowing to independence movements. Proxy wars became feasible because weapons could be supplied without direct involvement. The network also preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Wehrmacht veterans working as arms dealers, trainers, or advisors passed on tactical and operational knowledge developed at great cost during the war. The effectiveness of combined arms operations, the importance of reconnaissance, the techniques of camouflage and concealment. These lessons learned on the Eastern Front and in North Africa migrated to jungles in Southeast Asia and to deserts in the Middle East. By the mid-1960s, the first generation of this recycled German military technology was wearing out. Weapons that had been manufactured in 1942 or 43 were now 20-plus years old, having seen hard service in multiple conflicts. But by then, global arms production had ramped up. American and Soviet weapons were flowing in quantity. The unique window when German weapons dominated the black market was closing, yet the networks themselves persisted. The routes established for moving German weapons now moved other material. The expertise in evading customs and concealing shipments remained valuable. The contacts in various governments who could be bribed to look the other way stayed in place. The infrastructure for the global arms trade had been built on German weapons, but it would survive their exhaustion. In Algeria, French forces fighting the FLN independence movement in the 1950s found themselves combating guerrillas armed with weapons that felt disturbingly familiar. The MG-42 machine guns, the MP-40 submachine guns, even the stick grenades, all German designs the French had themselves used during and after the war. French intelligence traced the supply routes back through Egypt, through Skorzeny's network, to depots in Germany that had been missed in the initial post-war accounting. The French tried to shut down these supply lines, but it was like trying to dam a river with sand. Block one route and the weapons flowed through another. Pressure one dealer and another emerged. The network was resilient precisely because it was decentralized, organic, responsive to incentives rather than controlled by any single authority. The ultimate irony was that the major powers, while publicly condemning the black market, often found it useful. When the CIA wanted to arm anti-communist guerrillas without leaving American fingerprints, they bought weapons on the black market. When the Soviets wanted to supply revolutionary movements without direct involvement, they used similar channels. The shadow network became an auxiliary to official policy, a deniable tool for interventions that couldn't be acknowledged. By the time the Cold War reached its peak in the 1970s and 80s, German weapons had been largely superseded by newer designs. But their influence lingered in unexpected ways. The Kalashnikov rifle, which became the Cold War's iconic weapon, owed clear debts to German design principles. The ubiquitous RPG-7 anti-tank weapon traced ancestry to German Panzerfaust designs. Even as the original German weapons disappeared from front lines, their genetic code persisted in their descendants. The shadow networks had served as distribution channels for more than just weapons. They had distributed knowledge, tactical doctrines, and technical expertise. They had connected former enemies in business relationships that transcended ideology. They had demonstrated that technology, once released, cannot be controlled. It flows wherever need and profit intersect, following paths that official channels cannot predict or prevent. As the sun set on the black market's German weapon era, a lesson remained. The tools of war don't stay where they're placed. They migrate, reproduce, evolve. They find users in conflicts their creators never imagined. And the networks that distribute them create connections, some legal, some not, that shape global conflict patterns for generations. The underground river of steel that began flowing in 1945 had carved channels that would carry different weapons to different wars. But the channels themselves remained invisible infrastructure beneath the surface of international relations. By 1970, economists had calculated something remarkable. Every dollar invested in captured German technology had returned $100 in civilian innovation. The conversion coefficient seemed almost too perfect, as if nature itself had encoded a transformation ratio into the process of turning weapons into tools of peace. The swept wings that made the Me-262 lethal now graced the Boeing 707, carrying business travelers and families across continents at 600 miles per hour. Messerschmitt engineers who had designed fighters to intercept Allied bombers now worked in Seattle, applying their knowledge of high-speed aerodynamics to civilian aviation. The transformation was complete. Principles discovered for destruction now served connection. Consider what happened on July 20, 1969. 3 men stood on the moon, having traveled there aboard a rocket whose combustion chambers, fuel pumps, and guidance systems all traced their lineage directly to the V-2. The same basic engine design that killed 3,000 people in London had evolved through 24 years of development until it was powerful, enough to escape Earth's gravity. Entirely, Werner von Braun watched from Mission Control in Houston, the architect of both weapons and wonders. The hands that had drawn plans for rockets aimed at civilians now directed humanity's first steps on another world. The transformation wasn't just technical, it was moral. A reversal so complete, it seemed to prove that redemption was possible even for technologies born in darkness. But the space program represented only the most visible conversion. Deeper transformations were occurring across industrial civilization, as German wartime innovations found peacetime applications that would have astonished their creators. German synthetic fuel processes, developed because the Reich lacked petroleum, became the foundation of the modern plastics industry. During the war, German chemists had learned to transform coal into liquid fuel through Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. Post-war chemical engineers realized these same processes could produce the building blocks for plastics, creating materials that would transform manufacturing, packaging, and consumer goods. By 1970, plastics were everywhere, in cars, in packaging, in household items, in medical equipment. The chemistry that had kept German tanks running in the absence of oil now surrounded humanity in useful polymers, each one a descendant of wartime necessity transformed into peacetime abundance. Nerve gas research yielded an even more unexpected conversion. German chemists developing organophosphate compounds for chemical weapons had created substances that interfered with nerve function. After the war, researchers studying these compounds realized they could target insect nervous systems while being less harmful to humans. These chemicals became pesticides that triggered the Green Revolution, increasing crop yields and feeding millions. The same chemistry designed to kill soldiers now protected harvests. The moral complexity of this transformation cannot be ignored. Should we celebrate that nerve gas research saved lives through improved agriculture? Or should we recoil at the connection? The answer perhaps lies in recognizing that knowledge itself is morally neutral. It's the application that carries ethical weight. The chemists who developed organophosphates for weapons likely never imagined their work feeding the hungry. But that's what happened. Through a chain of scientific inquiry that cared nothing for intentions, Kurt Tank's journey exemplified the geographic spread of this knowledge transfer. The designer of the Focke-Wulf 190, a fighter so effective that Allied pilots learned to avoid engaging it, found himself in Argentina after the war. There he created the Pulque II, Argentina's first jet aircraft. The knowledge gained designing weapons for the Luftwaffe now lifted a neutral nation into the jet age. Tank didn't stop in Argentina. He moved to India, where his expertise helped establish an entire aerospace industry. Indian engineers learned aircraft design from a man who had learned it building some of the war's most feared fighters. The knowledge cascaded across continents and generations, each transfer adding new students who would themselves become teachers. Magnetic tape technology followed its own remarkable path. German engineers had perfected high-fidelity magnetic recording for radio broadcasts. American engineers studying captured equipment realized magnetic tape could store more than audio. By the late 1950s, IBM was using magnetic tape to store computer data, the first practical method for preserving digital information. That same technology then recorded music, giving birth to the modern recording industry. Then video, creating television as we know it. Then computer programs, then databases, then the digital archives that now preserve human knowledge. Every stage built on the previous one, but all traced back to German wartime innovation in broadcasting. Submarine batteries provided another example of unexpected civilian application. The advanced batteries in Type 21 U-boats could deliver enormous power for underwater sprint speeds. Engineers examining these batteries realized the energy, density and discharge characteristics had applications far beyond submarines. Electric vehicles in the 1970s used battery. Technology descended from U-boat power systems. Medical devices requiring reliable portable power incorporated design principles learned from submarine batteries. Even the batteries in early laptop computers owed debts to innovations driven by the need for underwater endurance. The transformation happened at every scale. At the largest scale, rocket engines that could have delivered nuclear warheads instead placed communications satellites in orbit, creating global telecommunications infrastructure. At the smallest scale, miniaturization techniques developed for proximity fuses, designed to detonate anti-aircraft shells near targets, evolved into the transistors that made modern electronics possible. Consider that progression. A proximity fuse needed to fit in an artillery shell, survive massive acceleration, then reliably detect a nearby aircraft and trigger detonation. This required electronics miniaturized beyond anything commercially available. Engineers solving this problem developed techniques for creating smaller, more reliable electronic components. These techniques, applied to peacetime electronics, enabled the transistor revolution that computerized civilization. Code-breaking computers followed a similar path. Both Germany and the Allies had developed specialized computing machines for cryptanalysis. These were among the first programmable computers, though their existence remained classified for decades. After the war, the engineers who had built them applied their knowledge to civilian computing, creating machines for business calculations, scientific research, and eventually personal use. The connection between wartime code-breaking and peacetime computing seems obvious now. But at the time, it required vision to see that machines built for one narrow purpose could be generalized. That vision came from people who had worked on classified wartime projects and recognized that the underlying principles had broader applications. Infrared technology underwent particularly dramatic conversion. German forces had used infrared scopes on rifles and searchlights on tanks, allowing them to see in complete darkness. The technology was classified, expensive, and barely practical with 1940s electronics. But the principle was sound, and post-war development made it progressively more capable. By the 1980s, infrared imaging had found dozens of civilian applications. Firefighters used it to see through smoke. Search and rescue teams used it to find people in darkness. Building inspectors used it to detect heat leaks. Medical researchers used it to study circulation and inflammation. The military technology had spawned an entire field of thermographic imaging. Perhaps most remarkably, ultrasound technology traced its ancestry to submarine sonar. The principles were identical. Send sound waves through a medium, detect reflections, interpret the pattern to determine what the waves encountered. German and Allied navies had pushed sonar technology to ever greater sensitivity and resolution, seeking submarines hiding in the depths. After the war, doctors wondered if similar principles could see inside living bodies without surgery. Early experiments were crude, but by the 1970s, ultrasound imaging had become routine for monitoring pregnancies. The technology that hunted U-boats now showed parents their unborn children, revealing life instead of targeting death. The economic impact of these conversions reshaped the post-war world. Nations that had acquired German technology through official programs or black markets found themselves with unexpected advantages in civilian industries. American aviation dominance in the 1950s and 60s built directly on captured German aerodynamic research. Soviet space achievements rested on German rocket technology. British jet engines powered by German-derived designs sold worldwide, but the diffusion continued. As patents expired and knowledge spread, the advantages democratized. By the 1970s, swept-wing aircraft were manufactured globally. Jet engines were produced in a dozen nations. The rocket technology that had been closely guarded secrets had spread enough that emerging space programs could build their own launch vehicles. The conversion followed thermodynamic principles. Energy neither created nor destroyed, merely transformed from one form to another. The industrial energy that had gone into weapons production, the engineering talent, the manufacturing capability, the accumulated knowledge, didn't vanish when the war ended. It transformed into peacetime production, following paths that nobody had planned, but that seem, in retrospect, almost inevitable. By the end of the 20th century, it had become difficult to find any advanced technology that didn't have some connection to wartime innovation. The computer you use, the aircraft you fly in, the medical devices that might save your life, the satellites that guide your navigation, all incorporate principles or techniques or materials that connect back to that frantic period of military innovation. This raises profound questions about the relationship between war and progress. Would we have developed these technologies without the urgent pressure of military necessity? Possibly, but certainly more slowly. War concentrates resources and removes constraints in ways that peacetime rarely matches. The result is often innovation at rates that seem impossible until they happen, but there's a cost beyond the obvious destruction. The technologies we have are shaped by their origins. Our space program evolved from weapons programs, which influenced its priorities and capabilities. Our electronics industry emerged from military needs for miniaturization and reliability. Our aviation infrastructure reflects military requirements for range and speed. What technologies might we have instead if we had invested those resources in purely civilian innovation? We'll never know, because that's not the path history took. We inherited technologies transformed from weapons, and we built our civilization using them as foundations. The transformation continues even now. GPS, originally a military navigation system, enables everything from driving directions to precision agriculture. The Internet, originally designed to ensure military communication survived nuclear attack, connects humanity in ways its creators never imagined. Each military technology contains potential civilian applications, waiting for someone to recognize them. In the end, the conversion from swords to satellites demonstrates something fundamental about human nature. We are capable of both tremendous destruction and tremendous creation, and sometimes the same minds, the same hands, accomplish both. The question isn't whether technology derived from weapons can serve peaceful purposes. Clearly, it can. The question is whether we can learn to pursue those peaceful purposes directly, without first traveling through the valley of destruction. The Earth remembers what we forget. Every month, construction crews in Berlin unearth another piece of the buried past. Artillery shells from street fighting in 1945. Unexploded bombs from Allied raids, caches of small arms hidden by soldiers who never returned. In 2019 alone, authorities removed 60 tons of unexploded ordnance from the city's soil. 60 tons. 8 decades after the war ended, the ground still gives back weapons at a rate that requires specialized teams working full-time. The bombs grow more dangerous with age, not less. Chemical triggers degrade into hair trigger sensitivity. Rust weakens casings until they can rupture from vibration. Explosives crystallize in ways that make them unstable. Every discovery becomes a delicate negotiation with time itself as bomb disposal experts approach shells that might detonate at any moment. In 2015, a Polish forest yielded something extraordinary. Two Panther tanks emerged from the earth, where they had rested for 70 winters, buried deliberately by their crews in the war's final days. The armor remained intact. The internal mechanisms, protected from moisture by cosmoline grease, could still function. Each tank sold to collectors for $2 million, making them among the most valuable archaeological finds of the decade. Consider the preservation. These 50-ton machines had been entombed in acidic soil, subjected to decades of freeze-thaw cycles, yet they survived essentially intact. The German engineers who designed them had built for durability in ways that exceeded even their own expectations. The tanks that were meant to last through months of combat endured through generations of peace. Lake Toplitz in Austria guards secrets in its depths. The lake is strange. Layers of salt water beneath fresh, creating zones where nothing decays, where oxygen never reaches. In the war's final days, SS units dumped cargo here, weighted with chains, meant to disappear forever. But the lake surrenders its treasures slowly to divers brave enough to descend into those dark waters. They have recovered printing plates for perfect counterfeit British pound notes, part of Operation Bernhard, a scheme to destabilize the British economy through forgery, boxes of gold teeth from concentration camp victims, and experimental weapons that challenge our understanding of what German technology achieved. Caseless ammunition decades ahead of its time, acoustic homing devices for torpedoes, even rumors of documents describing nuclear research. Each discovery from Toplitz rewrites small pieces of history. Each recovery reveals that what we thought we knew was incomplete. The lake likely holds more, but diving there is extraordinarily dangerous. Several divers have died in its depths, making it a tomb for both Nazi secrets and those who seek them. Modern archaeology has transformed the search for buried weapons. Ground-penetrating radar maps forgotten underground factories. Magnetometers detect metal beneath forest floors. Sonar scans lake and river bottoms. Each technology, ironically many descended from military applications, helps locate what earlier generations missed or deliberately concealed. In 2012, researchers used these techniques to map the full extent of Mittelbau-Dora, the underground rocket factory. They discovered chambers and tunnels never recorded in any archive, suggesting production lines that assembled weapons whose existence remained unacknowledged. How many V-2 rockets were actually built? The question remains open because the physical evidence keeps appearing. A barn in Normandy concealed an intact Me-2 6.2 for decades. The farmer who owned the barn knew it was there. German soldiers had hidden the jet fighter in the war's final days, then disappeared. The farmer told no one, unwilling to invite authorities onto his property. When he died, his children found the aircraft, still bearing its Luftwaffe markings, its swept wings folded to fit through the barn door. It now resides in a museum, one of only a handful of complete examples surviving. Norwegian fjords, with their extreme depths and cold water, preserve things that would decay elsewhere. In 2014, divers located a complete Type 21 submarine resting on the bottom of a fjord, its pressure hull intact, its batteries and engines still installed. The submarine had been scuttled by its crew rather than surrendered. Now it sits in water so cold that decay proceeds at glacial pace, a time capsule from 1945, waiting in the depths. Czech forests have yielded entire weapons caches. In 2016, hikers reported strange metal objects protruding from a stream bank after heavy rains. Authorities excavated and found an SS weapons depot. Dozens of machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, anti-tank weapons, even a small artillery piece. All had been buried carefully, wrapped in protective material, hidden so well that 70 years passed before erosion revealed them. These sleeping giants pose practical challenges. Who owns a tank recovered from a forest? What do you do with thousands of rounds of ammunition that might detonate if disturbed? How do you preserve artifacts that are simultaneously historically valuable and potentially lethal? Different nations have developed different approaches. In Germany, all weapons from the Nazi era belong to the state, regardless of where they're found. In Poland, finders can sometimes keep discovered weapons if they're registered and deactivated. In Austria, the laws are complex, varying by what's found and where. The result is a patchwork of regulations governing artifacts that nobody planned to regulate because nobody expected them to keep appearing. The recovery process has become a specialized field. Experts who can identify weapons from fragments, conservators who can stabilize decaying materials, historians who can contextualize discoveries, and always, bomb disposal technicians who ensure that history doesn't explode in anyone's face. Some discoveries are mundane, but numerous. Every year, farmers across Europe plow up small arms, grenades, and artillery shells. The items are so common that many countries have hotlines specifically for reporting them. The calls come in daily. A gardener finds a grenade, a child discovers a rusted pistol, a construction crew unearths a cache. Each represents a fragment of the war still working its way to the surface. But other discoveries are unique. In 2018, renovations of a Berlin apartment building revealed a room sealed since 1945. Inside sat a complete German communication station, Enigma machine, code books, radio equipment, abandoned so suddenly that documents still lay on the desk. The room had been walled over and forgotten, preserving a snapshot of the war's final days. The sleeping giants teach us about materials science and engineering durability in ways their creators never intended. Weapons designed to last months or years have now endured 8 decades. Some fail, corroding beyond recognition. Others survive remarkably intact. The differences reveal which designs, which materials, which manufacturing techniques stand the test of time. Collectors drive much of the recovery effort, offering substantial sums for intact weapons. A working MG-42 machine gun might fetch $30,000. A complete Luger pistol in good condition, $5,000. Helmet, uniform, and personal items each has its market value. This creates incentives for searching, but also for looting, as some seek profit over preservation. Museums compete for the most significant finds. A restored Panther tank draws visitors. An intact Me-262 becomes a centerpiece exhibit. The educational value is real. Seeing these machines helps people understand the scale and sophistication of German military production. But it also raises questions about glorification versus education, about whether displaying weapons aestheticizes violence. The process of restoration reveals forgotten knowledge. Restoring a Panther tank requires understanding its systems, which means consulting technical manuals, finding elderly veterans who remember the details, and sometimes reverse engineering components that no longer exist. Each restoration becomes an act of industrial archaeology, recovering knowledge along with the physical object. In 2020, ground-penetrating radar surveys in Bavaria located what appears to be an enormous underground facility, larger than any previously known. Its purpose unclear from the preliminary scans. Excavation would cost millions and take years. Meanwhile, it sits beneath farmland, its secret still buried, waiting for someone to fund the research that would reveal what lies beneath. These discoveries will continue for generations. Computer models suggest that only 30 to 40% of unexploded ordnance has been found. The rest remains, slowly working its way through soil and sediment, waiting for erosion or construction, or sheer chance to reveal it. Each discovery brings both historical insight and practical danger, knowledge and risk intertwined. The sleeping giants also remind us that history isn't safely in the past. It's buried in our fields and forests, hidden in our lakes and fjords, sealed in forgotten rooms. Every discovery proves that what we think we know is incomplete, that the Earth holds records we haven't yet read, that the war's physical legacy continues to surface in ways both mundane and extraordinary. As cities expand and forests are developed, the rate of discovery may actually increase. More construction means more excavation, means more encounters with buried history. The sleeping giants are waking not because they're choosing to, but because we're disturbing their rest, building over graves we forgot existed, plowing through battlefields that grass and trees have hidden, and still they emerge, a submarine from a fjord, a jet from a barn, tanks from a forest, weapons from streams and fields and building foundations. Each discovery a reminder that the transformation from weapons to peace is incomplete, that some swords have never been beaten into plowshares, that they sleep instead, waiting in the earth. In 2025, 80 years after the war ended, German military technology still shapes our world through 10,000 invisible threads. Look closely at the systems that surround you, and you'll find echoes of decisions made in wartime laboratories and factories. Innovations born from necessity that have outlived their creators by generations. The Kalashnikov rifle, the world's most common firearm, with over 100 million copies produced, traces its DNA directly to the STG-44, the first assault rifle. When Soviet designers examined captured German weapons, they saw a revolutionary concept. A rifle firing an intermediate cartridge, powerful enough for combat, but controllable in automatic fire. Mikhail Kalashnikov studied the German design and created his own interpretation. The result spread across every continent, appearing in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Africa to South America. The genetic lineage is unmistakable in the curved magazine, the gas-operated mechanism, the design philosophy prioritizing reliability over precision. Space stations docking in orbit use guidance systems whose principles were discovered in V2 development. The gyroscopic stabilization, the attitude control thrusters, the precision required to guide a vehicle traveling miles per second. All these challenges were first solved by German engineers trying to hit London from 200 miles away. The same mathematics that calculated ballistic trajectories now calculate orbital mechanics. Passenger jets fly on principles discovered in German wind tunnels. Every swept-wing commercial aircraft owes debts to research conducted at Peenemünde and other facilities, where engineers pushed past the barriers that limited conventional aviation. When you board a Boeing or an Airbus, you're trusting your life to aerodynamic principles proven in wartime. Transformed for peace, but fundamentally unchanged, submarines navigate using sonar, refined in U-boat wolfpacks. The principles of acoustic detection, signal processing, and target identification were developed in the desperate hunt beneath the Atlantic. Modern submarines, whether military or research vessels, use evolved versions of systems that German and Allied engineers created in their technological arms race under the waves. Museums worldwide preserve over 800 German tanks, each restoration costing $500,000. These aren't merely historical artifacts, they're repositories of mechanical knowledge. Maintaining a Panther tank requires understanding metallurgy, hydraulics, precision machining, and electrical systems. The restoration process preserves knowledge that would otherwise vanish as the generation that built these machines passes away. Military historians use German infrared technology to find archaeological sites. The same principles that let soldiers see in darkness now reveal ancient structures buried beneath soil. Heat differences between disturbed and undisturbed Earth, invisible to the eye, show clearly in thermographic imaging. Technology designed for targeting now serves discovery. Doctors employ ultrasound, descended from U-boat detection to see unborn children. The physics are identical. Sound waves penetrate tissue, reflections create images. What hunted submarines now monitors pregnancies, diagnosing problems before birth, showing parents their children's faces months before they emerge into light. Autonomous vehicles navigate using principles first tested in V1 flying bombs. The gyroscopes, the terrain-matching algorithms, the ability to maintain a course without human intervention, these were revolutionary in 1944. Now they guide cars through traffic, following digital maps instead of targeting coordinates, serving safety instead of destruction. The echoes resonate in unexpected ways. Modern GPS started as military technology, but enables precision agriculture, improving crop yields while reducing pesticide use. The Internet, designed to ensure communication survived nuclear war, connects humanity in ways that transcend national boundaries. Each military innovation contains seeds of civilian application, waiting for recognition. But the deepest echo isn't technological, it's philosophical. The transformation of German weapons poses questions that every generation must answer. How do we judge technologies born in darkness but serving light? Should we celebrate that V-2 rockets reached the moon, or condemn that they killed thousands? Can the same knowledge serve both destruction and creation? The answer perhaps lies in recognizing that technologies are tools, neither good nor evil in themselves. The morality resides in human choice, in how we apply knowledge, toward what ends we direct our innovations. The German scientists who built weapons made choices shaped by their circumstances. The scientists who transformed those weapons into tools of peace made different choices, shaped by different circumstances. Time becomes the ultimate alchemist in this process. Given enough time, weapons become artifacts, then curiosities, then inspirations for new technologies that serve entirely different purposes. The STG-44, designed to kill Soviet soldiers, inspired a rifle now used by countless armies, but also spawned sporting rifles for hunting and competition. The V-2, aimed at civilians, evolved into rockets that expand human knowledge and capability. The cycle continues. Technologies developed for current military purposes will be transformed by future generations into tools we cannot yet imagine. What seems sinister today may seem benign in retrospect. Just as weapons that terrified the 1940s now sit in museums. Educational tools for understanding history. 800 German tanks in museums. 100 million Kalashnikov rifles descended from German designs. Passenger jets on every continent flying with swept wings. Space stations using guidance derived from missiles. Ultrasound in every hospital. GPS in every phone. The echoes are everywhere once you learn to hear them. But the greatest legacy may be the lesson itself, that transformation is possible, that purposes change even when principles endure, that the same species capable of creating devastating weapons also possesses wisdom to transform destruction into creation. We inherited technologies born in war, and we've largely turned them toward peace. The question is whether we can learn to create powerful technologies directly for peaceful purposes, without first traveling through the valley of war. The echoes will continue as long as we use technologies descended from that era. Every time a jet crosses the sky, every time a GPS provides directions, every time a doctor uses ultrasound, every time satellites communicate across continents, the echo of decisions made 80 years ago resonates through our lives. In the end, the story of German weapons isn't just about technology transfer or industrial espionage or black markets. It's about transformation. How steel meant for destruction became steel for construction. How knowledge of killing became knowledge of healing. How weapons of war became tools of peace. It's about the remarkable human capacity to take what exists and reimagine it for new purposes. The transformation continues. Technologies we consider military today will become civilian tomorrow. The process is as old as civilization. The same metals forged into swords become plowshares. The same chemistry that creates explosives fertilizes crops. The same engineering that builds tanks builds tractors. Each generation performs this alchemy, turning yesterday's weapons into today's tools. And perhaps that's the ultimate echo. Not the specific technologies, but the pattern itself. The understanding that nothing is locked into its original purpose. That transformation is always possible. That given time and intention, we can redirect even the most destructive technologies toward constructive ends. That's the lesson written into every swept wing, every orbital dock, every ultrasound image, every GPS coordinate. The weapons are gone or sleeping. The technologies persist, transformed. The echoes continue, eternal reminders that we shape our tools, and our tools shape us. That history isn't past, but present in the systems that surround us. That the choices made in darkness can, through time and effort and wisdom, be transformed into foundations for light.